Morning to you. I want to thank the committee for allowing me to make this presentation, which I'm making on behalf of the Global Ethics Research Group at WHO. And what I will be presenting, and on behalf of the WHO Ethics Review Committee, for which I'm the outgoing chair, so not the present chair, just to a small correction there. And what I will be trying to take you through is the kind of experience that we had in the research protocols that were submitted to us and are being submitted to us for the Ebola virus and for the Zika virus. At about the time that the WHO got involved in this, we had a very large meeting in response to the Ebola epidemic. This is in August 2014. And it really was a surprise to many people that the first committee meeting that we were holding on this subject was ethical considerations for unregistered interventions. And it was an advisory panel to the WHO. It had people from the affected countries, as well as ethicists and drug developers, vaccine developers. And as part of that consultation, for the first time, research on investigational drugs or vaccines was authorized in the context of an epidemic, an ongoing epidemic that was essentially spiraling out of control and having a profound effect on the 3 or 4 countries in the region that were extremely weak and had difficult health systems. And apart from indicating that research could be done in the context of that epidemic, they indicated that we should offer experimental interventions to patients on condition there was adequate safety data, that the criteria for compassionate use was met, mainly for treatments rather than vaccines, that information on product uncertainty was given in the information sheet and the informed consent to patients who were part of any research, and that there would be fair distribution, informed consent, and confidentiality of patients that were enrolled in any research would be protected. And part of what they said explicitly was that because of the higher mortality rates in children and pregnant women, and this is from data derived from the previous epidemic, that pregnant women and children should be considered particularly vulnerable to Ebola virus and given special protection in the interventions to be considered. So this was at the beginning of the research that was going to be done. There was a clear statement by the countries, the product developers, the affected health systems and the ministers of health from the affected countries, and the ethicists that said that pregnancy should be included as well as children, and they should be given special protection. And obviously the WHO Ethics Review Committee took these recommendations quite seriously. And what I'm going to show you is the extent to which these recommendations were put in practice. In other words, were children, we obviously not focusing on that in this particular meeting, but pregnant women, were they given special protection? Most of you are very familiar with the drug development process. It's been referred to several times in this meeting that you essentially have the phase 1, 2, and 3. Usually you do healthy normal volunteers after you've done all your preclinical work indicating that there's a prospect for this drug or vaccine to be used in humans. You do your dose ranging studies, your safety studies, and before you go into the phase 3 where you're sort of enlarging the numbers that can be recruited, which you do just before, and if it shows benefit, both acceptable safety and efficacy, the drug is approved for marketing. Often pregnant women are excluded from much of that, and you get the pregnancy risk assessment in the phase 4 that is post-marketing. And all of the drugs and vaccines are essentially marketed by the pharmaceutical industry and regulated by the different regulatory authorities in the countries of relevant jurisdiction. And there are increasing efforts to make sure that pregnant women are included as early as possible. The rules don't necessarily apply in conditions where there's really a very high risk of death, which was the case for Ebola. We were seeing the death rate, dependent very much on the Ebola treatment unit, but we never were referred to in protocols of a death rate that was below 40%, and it could be as high as 100%, dependent very much on the targeted population and the location of that Ebola treatment unit. So we knew right from the start that we were seeing or going to be seeing protocols that had extremely high death rate. We had prior evidence, not evidence in the 2014 to 16 epidemic, of what the death rate was in children and in pregnant women. In fact, in pregnant women, the data is still not necessarily not out. And the death rate from the previous epidemics indicated there was a very low survival rate for women who were pregnant. And with Ebola, essentially, many women bled to death in the previous epidemic. It was a high stillbirth rate and 100% fetal mortality. There was no fetus that survived when the mother and the fetus had Ebola virus, and high neonatal mortality to those that survived the birth. We also knew that even if the viremia had resolved and the woman was still pregnant, that the Ebola virus was found in the amniotic fluid. Essentially, the woman was carrying an Ebola bomb. And people get very worried when they see pregnant women with Ebola virus. So the routine practice was, or standard of care was not to test for pregnancy, and therefore in many cases reproductive status was unknown. And we had very little data in this particular epidemic. So WHO essentially saw pretty much all of the work that was being done. I think there are very few pieces of work that we did not see as part of the protocols that were being sent to us. And many of the protocols came within a very short period of time. They came essentially pretty much after the meeting in August, from September 2014 to about January, February 2015. We dealt with 19 new protocols, 36 submissions. We had a very fast response time. I have to thank the committee members that were part of this sort of smaller group that essentially took a lot of time to look at the protocols very carefully at times and it was obviously spiraling, and we didn't want to be part of the problem. We wanted to be able to deal with it as quickly as possible. And of the I've split it into the vaccines above and the treatment below. So, and of the treatment trials, we had convalescent into the type of phase that they were. In the convalescent plasma trial, in Guinea, pregnant women were included. There was an analog of ZMapp produced by the Chinese that was being tested by MSF, and that also included pregnancy. The favipiravir and the brincidofovir did not include pregnancy. And MSF, at least in the protocol that we reviewed, in the favipiravir, I understand from Severine later on that it was reclassified under the monitoring of emergency therapeutic interventions that have not been registered. I always forget what MURI stands for, but Severine will probably refer to it soon. And MSF essentially persuaded the drug company that if you didn't deal with the virus in the woman, the baby had little prospect of survival. And so this might be a way of getting at least one of those children to survive, because we had a 100% mortality rate for fetuses. Remdesivir excluded pregnancy because the reproductive toxicity studies indicated that it shouldn't be used. Now we come to the vaccines. So 2 out of 4 that we saw included pregnancy. One of the vaccine trials that was done, now these were the phase 1 and phase 2. We didn't actually see the review the Liberia trial. Were in Mali and Switzerland. And usually what you do is you do both dose ranging studies, and you do them obviously in a vaccine in healthy volunteers. So in this particular case, we saw the protocols that were done in Mali and in Switzerland. The Gambia pulled out. And for the Zibov vaccine, we saw all of the trials. This was heavily involved. WHO was heavily involved in the second group of trials, the Zibov vaccine, which was done in Switzerland, Germany, Gabon, and Kenya. In Switzerland, they did adults, and they included adults who would soon be deployed to the affected countries. And we asked for preferential inclusion of such adults if they volunteered. So these were phase 2 studies. In Gabon, they did children below the age of 18 to look at efficacy and safety in younger patients. In Kenya, it was very similar to Switzerland as well as Germany. So these were phase 2 trials, and they were pretty much complete by January 2015, so that phase 3 was beginning, and we had a protocol within February. So this was a very much narrowed funnel of work that was being done in very difficult circumstances in the affected countries, the phase 3. Some of you may know it as the Ring trial, which was done in Guinea, and then an amendment to Sierra Leone. And as is normally the practice, all of the work in the phase 2 studies didn't include pregnant women. In the phase 3 studies, they excluded pregnant women. And our comments were, why? Why are you excluding children and pregnant women? They have a similar risk of death. They have a similar risk of infection. You include them. They didn't include, and we weren't, with no justification given. And then when the first results came out in about June 2015, showing efficacy, that is to say that those who was a delayed versus immediate treatment with the vaccine, the DSMC suggested they include pregnancy as well as children. We suggest they did, the local IRBs as well, and it was not submitted as an amendment. So we had very little data on the vaccines in pregnancy. In fact, no data. The observational trials essentially, the one that it did include, but this was obviously just observation, was persistence of Ebola virus in body fluids, which had a nested study in pregnancy. So I'm summarizing essentially that the treatment trials tended as far as possible to include pregnancy. The vaccines did not, even when they were asked to by the DSMC or the IRBs. And the IRB's dilemma in this case at WHO was we had an emergency. We had very high mortality rates in EBV patients. And our problem was, should we force the issue, insist that pregnancy and children should be included? And if we did so, there would be this long negotiation, and the protocol that was intended to be implemented would be delayed. So our problem was really one on who benefits, and is it worth fighting the case, or should we wait for an amendment? So it was really speed versus justice. It's not an easy dilemma to face in this kind of epidemic. And we had no data to argue the case from that epidemic. We had previous data from the previous epidemic of this high mortality risk of the loss of pregnancies. And the researchers couldn't justify to us why they were excluding. At least we were not dealing directly with the pharmaceutical companies, we were dealing with the researchers. And so they essentially said it wouldn't be allowed. And so our problem was, do we approve as is and not delay the research and wait until we get initial data and then negotiate, or do we approve excluding pregnancy? So a summary of all of this work that came before us is that we, in infection that causes such high mortality and total mortality in the case of fetuses, at what point would women be included? How unsafe was the vaccine that it was worth losing lives not to test it? And this leaves us with very little data for the next epidemic, which by definition cannot include people who are pregnant. The Zika virus I will spend much less time on. We have listened yesterday in the evening to a lot of presentations showing how important it is, both here as well as on the African continent, where it was initially identified, where there is no treatment available. People have mentioned that the diagnosis is more reliable in certain body fluids and not in others. The negative PCR test is not always reliable, so when you have it, you can state that you have it, but not reliably when you don't. There are cohort studies that have been developed between the different sites and the Reproductive Health Department of WHO, case control, prospective, some of which I understand have already begun, as was referred to yesterday. And some of the issues, the ethical issues that are likely to be brought up in these were really elucidated yesterday. It's what is the standard of care? What do you do in pregnancies where ultrasound, which may not be part of standard of care but might be part of the research, identifies a malformation in conditions where even therapeutic abortion might not be considered to be legal, or there might be a culture that is not willing to accept it. And who bears the responsibilities, if and for how long, in both research and non-research conditions? And then this is something that applied both in the Ebola as well as, I'm sure, in the Zika, that does the focus of a pandemic take away resources from normal routine care. It's my final reflections. We had a clear mandate to provide special protection in pregnancy, and we didn't succeed. And it's not for want of DSMCs or the IRBs trying to insist. Timelines were tight, and we found ourselves with dilemmas if we tried to insist too much. And pharma is not going to listen to moral arguments. We had a very nice presentation yesterday from legal representatives where I found it quite refreshing to hear. Well, if you want something, to find a legal way to do something, let us know, and we'll try and find a way for you. I think the regulatory authorities really quite have to be involved, because pharma listens to them more than to moral arguments. And if we don't have agreements on how to include women in pandemics, in epidemics, which have such a poor consequence on their life expectancy, and the expectancy of their prospective child, we won't advance before the next epidemic. This is my final slide. Thank you very much.